Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's my great privilege then to welcome our speaker today, Professor David Bartholomew, who is the Emeritus Professor of Statistics at the London School of Economics, was there for many years. He was President of the Royal Statistical Society for a number of years. He was also Chairman of the Science and Religion Forum for a number of years as well. So he's been very involved in writing in the whole area of science and religion, as well as obviously his whole area of maths and so forth. So who better then to speak to us today on Victor Stenger's scientific critique of Christian belief. So thank you very much, David.
First thing is to check that I can make this thing work. That is the first and obvious question, which must be in many of your minds, because maybe Victor Stenger isn't a household name. He is in fact a retired physicist. He got his PhD from the University of California in Los Angeles. He then moved to University of Hawaii, from which he commuted to places like Berkeley because he was a particle physicist. He's about my age or slightly younger, which will leave you guessing. He's also a new atheist, and the term is his own term, but I think by the time I've finished, I will have justified it. He's now living in Colorado, where I think he's called an adjunct professor of philosophy. But if you look at his website, which he publicizes his activities, you will see he's on the road for part of the year, and that means he's going around to mainly like-minded groups of secularists or whatever, doing whatever he does. Dennis referred to this paper in Christians in Science. What I'm going to say is largely based upon that, but I'm going to view it, as it were, through the lens of having met him. In June, I did a radio debate, it was called. It was really a structured discussion. And Justin Brierley, who chaired it, was clever enough to introduce all the points that I'm going to make today into the discussion. So I had the opportunity of hearing his response to them. I should say that they were very much off the cuff. He didn't know in advance what I was going to say, or conversely, because the whole thing was structured. And I would hope that his considered replies might have a little more depth, but I must leave you to judge that. He's a fairly prolific author, and there are three books pictured here. The second one is the one which justifies his claim to be a new atheist. It's called The New Atheism, and the subtitle is perhaps more significant. It says, Taking a Stand for Science and Reason. I'm all in favour of science and reason, but he regards it as opposed to anything religious. There are two other books there. The one on the right-hand side, Quantum Gods, is his, well, penultimate book, I think, which has a lot of physics in and not very much theology. The other one has Science Found God as an older one. It raises some of the questions which I should touch on briefly, but more relevant to what I'm going to say today is the book in the centre here, God the Failed Hypothesis. And as always, the subtitle is more revealing. It's what the publisher wants you to buy. How Science Shows That God Does Not Exist. That's in small letters. The foreword is written by Christopher Hitchens, whose book God Is Not Great is flanking him on the left, the international bestseller, as you will notice. On the back, there is a quotation from Richard Dawkins, which I'll show you in a moment, who's best known, of course, in this field for the book on right hand. Stenger is different in that he writes a book about every 2 years, and it's difficult to avoid repeating yourself on that kind of cycle, and he's well aware of this fact. I'm going to show you 3 or 4 quotations which are aimed at positions, so you can find what his interest is and where he's coming from, as it were. Because it's difficult to read things on the screen, I've highlighted the bits that matter, and the main allusion here is to something I'm not going to talk about. But notice it says it needed a good physicist to show us the fallacy of what's gone before, and Victor Stenger lucidly does this. But the bit I most like is the last bit. I learned an enormous amount from this splendid book. I didn't know Richard Dawkins was quite so gullible, but or whether he read the book. But as I hope to show, it's a fallacious thing almost entirely. When I met him, he had recently come from a meeting with Richard Dawkins, who had informed him that his book had just passed the 3 million sales mark, which I think is good by anyone's standards. And Stenger believed that his own book got onto the New York Times bestseller list, partly because of this endorsement by Richard Dawkins on the back. This, I think, expresses more clearly than anything where he stands and what his position is. If no plausible natural explanation can be found for an observation, then a supernatural cause may be considered. Indeed, the reason I deem the God hypothesis to have failed is precisely because no physical phenomena have been reliably shown to exist that require to go beyond natural explanations. Stenger takes a hard science line, and I think he has to be counted on his own territory. He says, in effect, as you'll see in a moment, come up with some good evidence that stands up and I will seriously consider being a believer. This is from his The New Atheist, but it's the kind of thing he's said in most of his books. Starting about halfway down, he says, if and when anyone finds evidence for God's existence, God's or the supernatural, that stands up under the stringent tests that are applied in science to any claimed new phenomenon, then he'll join. And he makes a great deal of the fact that he's open-minded. He'll consider evidence if it comes along. And last of these quotations, to set the scene, this bit in bold type in the middle is a kind of mantra which he repeats. He's obviously been tackled many times, and people say to him that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. He says that's not true. He says absence of evidence that should be there is valid evidence of absence. So if you can't find anything and you ought to have found something, if God is who you claim he really is, then that's that counts against God. And his unwavering, I think, and consistent position is that he's a scientist. There are good scientific methods of getting at the truth, and they've worked remarkably well in studying the natural world, unless they can deliver the goods in belief. It's not very much. Now, he argues that if God is present and active, not a deistic kind of God, then there ought to be some signs of him action. And therefore it ought to be possible to detect that he's doing things, and there are tests which you can apply. And he identifies two fields in particular where it ought to be possible to make a scientific test of what Christians and other believers claim. And one is revelation. In other words, if there is knowledge in the world that can't be attributed to people, that could only have come from someone, as it were, outside it all, who knows it all, then it ought to be there. And I'll give you an example in a moment. The other example is intercessory prayer. After all, if Christians are always asking for things, sometimes at least there ought to be tangible evidence that their prayers have worked, and it ought to be possible to test that scientifically. I'm going to take those two in order. I'm dealing with the first one fairly quickly because that's not the place where I want to really focus, I think. So we ask, how might revelation reveal God's existence? And his answer to that would be by making predictions which are testable and verifiable. And in his view, although the Bible is full of such things, there are whole books attributed to prophets and so on, he doesn't regard any of them as clear-cut. He describes them as ambiguous and not providing convincing evidence. You might want to argue on that, but that's the line that he would take. So there has been no verifiable predictions that can be decently attributed to revelation. So if you ask him, well, what would satisfy you then, he'll give you a number of examples. The one that he gave in discussion with me was predicting the date of the next Los Angeles earthquake. But another one he uses is a prediction that man would walk on the moon. To get 1969 requires perhaps an unreasonable degree of precision in view of the fact that calendars have changed. So say before 2000. Now if you wanted to make fun at his expense, you would say, well, it's a bit hard luck on preachers in the 17th century or the 18th. Would have to said, well, in 200 or 300 years' time we shall know. In the moment you'll have to wait and hope. But that is the kind of thing which he thinks would be verifiable. And if buried somewhere in Ezekiel there was a text which said, you know, before 2 millennia have passed, man will walk on the moon, or something of that sort, and we now know that that happened, then we've got clear empirical evidence of the kind that one would want. I leave you to reflect on that and go on to what I think is more interesting and one. That is prayer answered. Can you conduct experiments which would stand up to scientific scrutiny, which establish it happens? And he will say, he has said, there are billions, maybe trillions of prayers that have been offered. They're offered every day. And since many of them, at least, are directed at changing the way things are, then it ought to be possible to detect signs of that. And for him, the gold standard is the double-blind experiment. Now, those of you who are familiar with clinical trials will know what this is. It's basically the form of experimentation used to judge the efficacy of a new proposed treatment. You give the new drug to some people and you don't give it to the others. If it's effective, there ought to be a difference. But people respond differently to drugs, so you have to mix people up a bit and make sure you haven't selected one group that respond rather successfully, so you randomise the subjects. That, at least if you have large enough numbers, will reduce the risk of that situation to an acceptable minimum. The double-blind bit refers to the fact that if somebody knows that they're getting a drug which is believed to be efficacious, there is a well-known placebo effect and they may show improvements anyhow. So you must make sure that the people administering the drug don't know which one they're giving. And the double bit comes in because you must also make sure the other way, that it may be that a person giving the drug by some subconscious movement or in some way or other conveys information which would trigger a placebo effect. And that's the standard way of drug testing, and he wants something like that for prayer. And he says there have been many tests of prayer, and the results are all anecdotal. That's a favourite word of Victor's, and we'll come back to again. Anecdotal means it looks as if it's going in the right direction, but you can't really be sure. He wants a really cast iron experiment. He thinks there are only two in existence. If you read his book, you'll get the details. They're both American. One relates to cardiovascular disease. And there are complications which it's not relevant for me to go in. But basically, people prayed for the recovery, or rapid recovery or something, of these patients. And to begin with, it looked as if things were going in favour of prayer. But by the time it was all over, none of them showed a significant effect. And Stenger's conclusion from that is that the God who answers prayer does not exist. He's always careful with his qualifications, like a God who answers prayer. There might be some theistic God out there who takes no interest at all, and one wouldn't expect to happen. So the question is, what could one or should one infer from that? Well, I maintain that's not good science, because the double-blind experiment isn't strictly applicable in those conditions, because the conditions are not met. Basically, what you're trying to do is to control the situation. And if you do that successfully, you have to be controlling God. And unless you believe that God is a puppet and will do whatever is asked whenever is asked, then this wouldn't work. But more formally, there's no place in the protocol of this experiment for a freely acting God. It requires God to do what we want. And that is my argument, that none of these experiments will ever deliver the goods, because you cannot control God, and if you cannot control God, you cannot be sure whether he's acting or not. And what does Victor Stenger say to that? Well, he says, what would you have concluded if it had given a positive result? He said, if that experiment had come out with significantly more people recovering quickly, theologians over the world were throwing up their hands and saying, what a wonderful thing, we've told you this all along, and now we've got an experiment to prove it. Notice, though, it wouldn't prove the existence of God. All that it would prove is something odd was going on. There might be some extrasensory power or mind over matter or something of that sort. There's no requirement, it doesn't justify his conclusion, there is no God, because there are other possibilities. But even if all other explanations could be ruled out, the result, I maintain, would not be consistent with the Christian understanding of the nature of God. And there's a real difficult problem in there. Because unless you can push God around and get him to do what you want, you cannot experiment with him. And in my view, no experiment of this kind, however watertight from a scientific point of view, can possibly answer this question. It's a waste of time to try. One of these studies was financed by the Templeton Foundation, and I think they were mistaken in putting all that money into it, because one could have known in advance what conclusion you could draw. I should have said there may be some interest in knowing whether praying or laying hands to one or two other things in this experiment might have some effect. That would be interesting. Whether it's worth spending the money on it, I think is questionable. I don't think it tests the hypothesis that it's set out to. Now, the reason I got particularly interested in his work is that he uses a lot of statistical arguments. And I suspected he didn't understand them, and I'm sure now that he doesn't. There are two, I'm only going to take two, there are one or two others in the book. He talks about meta-analysis, now I'll say a bit about what that is in a moment, and he says a lot that's derived from inference from samples. Meta-analysis is really how you put the results of a number of experiments together. So if a lot of papers are published all testing some particular hypothesis, then you want to know what do they all add up to. That's what it is about. It's a very fashionable subject at the moment. There are courses in it, people publishing books, and all that sort of thing. So I want to take each of those in turn. It's concerned with a situation where we have, say, n experiments, and let's suppose that they all fail to yield significant results. It's impossible, Stenger claims, that if you put them together, you can somehow get a positive value out of it. That's his argument, basically. I put the last point in brackets because it's not central to the way the argument develops, but it illustrates Stenger's attitude to things in general. Physicists haven't found any need to do this, and therefore it can't be all that important. He can't think of any result in physics. I really don't believe that's true, because science is a cumulative activity, where, and in other occasions he will tell you, you don't accept the result of an experiment first time, you do it again and again in different places, if the same result comes out and begins to build up into a convenient case. So why do I think he's wrong? Well, let's begin by saying in what conditions he would be right. He would be right if the individual inferences are certain. He would say you can't take no for an answer, and he quotes cases of people who seem to go on doing experiments indefinitely in the hope that one day it will add up to. And he's wrong because these levels of significance are determined by probability calculations, which one can do, and one can demonstrate that what he says isn't necessarily true. But intuitively, you can see how it comes about. If you follow the thinking there in that last sentence. Supposing you have a lot of very small samples. Now, if you've got a small effect, a small sample may not be enough to detect it. But if you'd had a much larger sample, you might have put an aggregating samples, assuming independence and a lot of other things, then the combined sample is just like one bigger sample. And it is actually possible to get a significant result with the one large sample than with the individual pronomos. Now that's fairly illustrative of the way that Stenger really doesn't understand how these things go. And he's particularly gunning for extrasensory perception, where this sort of thing goes on all the way, but he doesn't make any clear distinction between God and extrasensory perception, as we'll have occasion to notice in a moment. But more damaging, I think, to Stenger is his reliance on estimates that are derived from samples. All his books are full of quantitative statements, and they come in various kinds. The prevalence of belief, how many unbelievers there are in the world or in the United States or wherever, things of that kind. That's what I mean by the prevalence of belief. He's interested in comparing believers with unbelievers, and I'll give you an example in a moment. If it could be shown, for example, that there is no real difference, then believing doesn't make any difference, and therefore it can't give any great significance. Or a bit more subtly, one might want to look at associations between belief and personal characteristics, whether men and women, for example, are different, or different cultures, or whatever. There are many questions of that kind which are, I think, uppermost in the minds of people, and you'll find his books have a lot of figures of that kind. And the implied inference, which is very seldom spelt out, is that if this is true, this is one nail in the coffin of religious belief. I put at the bottom there 2 requirements for anyone who wants to get into this game. You have to be careful what population you're talking about. And here we're talking about populations of people usually. So when it was done, where it was done, and all that kind of thing become relevant. And in many of these published surveys, there's precious little information given on that. There needs to be a proper sample, essentially a probability sample, so that you can make calculations about how likely whatever you've observed. Now, this is one of his conclusions. You might, if you read the book, think it's a little unfair because it's a fairly extreme one, but I've chosen it because it exemplifies many of the failings of the kind of thing he does. The references at the end, by the way, refer to these books that I mentioned. So GTFH means God the Failed Hypothesis. But many of these statements occur in different guises in different places. A statement is the empirical fact is that people with no religion are not noticeably less charitable than those with religion. And because believers and unbelievers don't differ very much, then the belief can't matter very much or be very important. When you start to take this apart, it's described as an empirical fact. So presumably there ought to be some documentation for it. How you measure charitability is very far from a simple question. One can think of many things that might be relevant, but how you construct some measure is not at all clear. And there are many other points of that kind you could make. So that you really want to go into this thoroughly, you've got to do it properly. And very seldom that the studies from which he quotes. Now, I put this to him in the discussion I had with him, and what you see on here is a succession of different views that he put. He first of all said, I'm very careful about my references. I always give references in my books, and if I fail to do so in this case, I'll then give one in later editions. Then he went on to say, in effect, well, if you lived in America, you would see how provoked I am. He related the names of a number of people, of whom Pat Robertson was one. And he did say to me on another occasion, at least you're not like Pat Robertson, which I take was intended to be flattering. Anyhow, he said he worked in an environment where people made very extreme statements, that if religion collapsed, civilization would collapse, and all sorts of other things would go wrong. And therefore, there was some kind of incentive on him to perhaps over-egg these conclusions a little bit. I felt he was softening this point, so I pressed him. I said, well, why did you put this in the book then? And he said, and if you listen to the podcast of this thing, which I think is still archived. If you check that I got it right, I've listened to it twice, I think he said such statements strengthen the atheist case. Well, of course they do. The question is whether they're true. And here I feel he gets into this anecdotal science question. Having got on his high horse and told us we must all be highly scientific and very rigorous and only assert what can be established without any question, and he dismisses the whole wealth of anecdote, what he calls anecdotes, it seems to me that this and many other statements of the same kind, which you will find in his books and elsewhere, are really little more than anecdote. They're not properly documented, you don't know where they came from, and one suspects that if one dug very far, he would begin to shift into the extenuating circumstances under which he and his kind labour. I have a certain sympathy with him, but I have no sympathy with him as someone who advocates a strictly scientific approach. And if I were taking you through this discussion I had with him, which lasted an hour, I think we're about halfway at this point. And here I'm going to depart from a line which I took in the paper which Dennis mentioned, because what I went to say at the end of that paper is if you're a scientist, you should take account of all the evidence. And there's clearly a great deal of evidence that isn't covered by the rather limited formal experiments or surveys and so on which you can do. And as we were discussing with him, I realised there are aspects here which I dismiss rather too readily, and they really come under this question: what counts as evidence? I was using evidence rather loosely because I thought it was a self-explanatory term, and it emerges that there are really two kinds of evidence that believers, Christians in particular, might hold to be relevant, which were not included under all this experiment thing. One was historical evidence, and in particular what I call the Jesus question, and then much more broadly, and this we discussed at some considerable length, subjective evidence, because in Stenger's understanding, everything which isn't hard, strict scientific is subjective, and subjective he dismisses out of hand. And under subjective you might include personal experience and collective experience. I don't want to spend time going into these things, but to my mind these are important areas which I think would figure in most rational scientific people's account of why they are believers or why other people might believe us. And I want to look at each of these in turn, and I'm aiming to leave plenty of time for discussion because I can pursue both of those. I think there's a real atheist dilemma on the question of Jesus, because you can't escape the fact that he's relevant, at the very least, to Christian belief. And there seem to be two quite distinct strands in the literature. There's one which Stenger himself follows, which is what I call sideline Jesus. There's a statement in one of his books which refers rather dismissively to the possibility of an obscure Nazarene carpenter who lived 2,000 years ago. I can't remember the words, but essentially that's it. He wants, as it were, to get this rather awkward feature of Christianity out on one side, to deal with what he regards as the main issues. And he does that in many ways by doing his best to ignore what would be the defining characteristic of Christianity, which I find a little odd, because sometimes you read his books, you'll catch him going on at some length, and then he's obviously thought better about it and says, of course, if this person existed. So I mean, he gets drawn into the debates and then realises that he has to backtrack. There's a second strand in this argument, which I've called "if you can't beat them, join them" line, which I think is more typical of the line that Dawkins takes, particularly in the God delusion. Dawkins, as far as I know, doesn't seriously attempt to disprove that Jesus existed or anything like that. In fact, he recounts, I think, how somebody sent him a T-shirt, Atheists for Jesus on it. Basically, what he wants to do is to appropriate the bits that he says secularists and others have always believed anyhow, which comes in some way by the light of nature. And the rest is just an accretion which can be safely discarded. That's what I mean by this statement, you can't beat enjoyment. You don't ignore this central thing, but you give it a different status and a different importance in that particular way. Now, this is a kind of interlude, because I discussed at some length what counted as good historical evidence, whether it had to be written, for example. And he says this is the man that he relies on. Now, I've never read any of Bart Ehrman's work. I've looked him up on the web, and what you see there is what I copied. So that's not my construction, that's what is said about him somewhere. He's published a number of books which you can get in the usual way through Amazon, and judging by their titles, and I've looked no further, I can see why Stenger finds them convenient. But he doesn't see, it seems sufficient to him that he can find one book which goes somewhere at least to supporting his case. He doesn't seem to recognise that there are armies of people working in this field and have been for a very long time. Now, there may be people here who know about this man and could supplement what I'm saying. All that I would say is it seemed very odd to me to base so much on such a slender strand as this gentleman who started in the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and then eventually became I'm not sure he's an agnostic or an atheist now, but anyhow, he's moved a long way, and presumably his published work, as it were, traces that progression of belief or unbelief. But Stenger certainly believes that so far as the historical record that you would find in the New Testament and so on is practically worthless. It was written down 40 years after, and I discussed with him what constituted as a kind of body of knowledge and how it might be handed on. And I said, do you regard something written as the key thing? He said, well, something written on stone would be better. What he wants is something actually tangible which secures the truth, in his view. I don't think this view stands up, and I think one wanted to probe it rather further, but I mention it as the way that he counters this particular objection. If you question him on the historical fact, he will refer to someone who he regards as an adequate authority, and says in effect that he doesn't really need to take it very much further. Well, that's I said there's a history aspect. Christianity is a historical religion which depends on certain things having happened at roughly a certain time in a certain place, and these would be a relevant consideration, one would have thought, in establishing a case for Christianity, or indeed trying to demolish it. But he seems, by this rather deft footwork, to be willing to bypass it, first by marginalising it in the way that I indicated, and then referring to authorities which may or may not be serious authorities. Again, I would like any New Testament scholars to tell me whether they've ever heard of this man, and whether he's reliable and trustworthy, and all the rest of it. Beyond that, he gets very much involved in the objective-subjective. Everything I mentioned that wasn't strictly objective in his sense, that is verifiable by controlled experimentation, is subjective, and subjective doesn't count because subjective isn't in. He says he's had debates with people like me, and they said, I love my wife, I can't produce you any evidence of the kind that would satisfy you. He dismisses that. That's purely subjective. He tells me I can believe anything I like, and he will defend my right to do so and to practice it. But it doesn't enter into the same category of truth. Now, he realizes, I think, that he would be open to the charge of scientism, namely that he regards the only truth that's out there to be apprehended is that which can be arrived at by scientific methods. And he denies this is the truth. He says new atheists, and he's one of them, appreciate the arts and humanities and value it and all the right. But I don't think he's thought through the meaning of these three terms here, truth, reality, and value. He somehow believes that these subjective experiences have value, but I don't think he thinks they're real. They're certainly not real to him in the sense that things which you can measure and weigh are real. And I put reality in the middle because you can, I think he would say that values are real. He experiences them and values them, if I can put it like that, in his extra scientific life. But they're not real in the same in the sense that counts. They're not verified or could not be verified by rigorous scientific experiment. The very last exchange at the end of this hour is that we just disagreed, because one comes to a point where I, for example, think these things are evidence, and good evidence. I agree with him that they're not the kind of evidence that one is getting by scientific experimentation, but I think they do count. For most people, I'm sure they're overwhelming. They're the only thing that counts. There are not many people. I only know of one person that claims to have been converted in a sense by a scientific argument, and that's Professor Anthony Flume. Though he isn't really now a Christian, he's a lifelong atheist who now professes to believe. And I read his book, and it seems to me that his argument for changing is no better than the arguments that he had before. I knew Anthony Flume once, and I worked with him at the University of Kiel, and we in the same group. Like most of these fearsome people, it's really quite pleasant when you get to know him. But he's written a book, or somebody's written it with his help, in which he declares that though a lifelong atheist, he's not one anymore, and that's upset people like Dawkins who see him as a traitor and so on. But the argument which he uses is essentially basically about probabilities of life having occurred and all that, which he doesn't think could have happened in any other way without some kind of deistic steering. I think that's his argument. But that's not usually the case. The vast majority, everyone else that I know, would not be a Christian or a believer any account on the grounds that they had read all the scientific literature and were convinced by that. That's not to say, I'm not talking about consistency, whether, I mean, one might expect the picture of the world revealed by science to be consistent with the picture of total reality. But that's a different question. Stenger is not talking about consistency. So what then is Stenger's scientific critique, which I began? I think it can be refuted on scientific grounds. I've given one or two examples in the course of this talk, and there are others. There are others in the book. Every one that I've examined, I just don't think is valid. I don't think the argument works. The reason I gave in connection with prayer experience works in that is appropriate in that particular situation. But I do not know of any of the elements in Stenger's what he calls proofs, which are good science, and I think one should attack him on those grounds. So I don't think his scientific arguments are valid. I think the real debate with such people has to be around the second one, whether it is legitimate to disregard all the evidence around either historical or subjective or whatever kind, with this airy dismissal of it, or it's all subjective. I said I would leave plenty of time for discussion. I hope I've done so, because I think I'd prefer to stop talking there and hear what other people might want to say.
Good, thank you very much. Well, we do have some good period of time for discussion, so please, it's over for you. Questions and comments, please. Let's start. Please, yes.
I just wanted to say that there is a huge amount of research in the psychology of religion academic literature on the relationship between religious people, religious believers, people who confess a faith, and all sorts of rather strange behaviours. Prejudice, authoritarianism, narrowness of thinking, closed thinking, and there's a huge amount there. So the point about what was your example about prayer not working? There's a great deal to show that, but perhaps he would think that psychology isn't science, and perhaps he would dismiss all of that anyway. But and that started, I believe, the first one I know of was in the 30s in America, but loads in the 50s, 60s, 70s in America, and that generated a whole raft of scientific research on the basis of, well, there's different kinds of behaviours, there's different kinds of what we mean by religion, and it comes right back to what do we mean by religion.
Yeah.
But there is a huge...
Can you hear at the back or not?
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, the question is about the psychology of religion and the huge amount of research there's been on the psychology of religion and the scientific study of religion, and how does that inform the present discussion?
Well, I'd be very surprised if he's very much acquainted with this kind of thing. I mean, one of the things that I said to him in this discussion is the trouble with you, you're a physicist. I didn't mean to denigrate physics in any way. I could have easily been a physicist myself. I think he's spent his whole life working in that field. He doesn't conceive of any other activity could be called science, and it's not called science, it doesn't count. He has engaged more than many, I think, in serious discussion with what he would loosely call believers. And he trots out things that he's picked up from them. But I don't think, and I didn't want to score cheap points in the talk, I don't think he's really understood what they're driving at. I think he'd brush your comment aside with say, okay, that's...
It's one of the largest pieces of research in that discipline.
No doubt, yes.
Point.
Yeah.
Thank you. At the back, please, yes.
Can I make a point about subjective evidence? Because it seems to me that if you're living in a community where people say to you, I have a relationship with God, I have certain feelings, and I understand my relationship to the world in a certain way, that might be very strong evidence for you as a member of that community to say, well, I want to experience this, or at least test this out. And then perhaps have personal experiences yourself, which you come to interpret the same way, and therefore you come to see as validating other people's ideas, and you start to share with them, this is what your experiences are. However, to somebody completely outside of that, who starts off with a mindset of rejecting the possibility of this, you can always find other arguments. I haven't read the book, so I don't know if he does, but you can always find other arguments to explain away those experiences people have. And say, yes, they have these experiences. There's evidence that they believe these things, there's evidence they have experiences, but we can explain these in terms of hormones and psychology and cultural, social matters and so on. So I think there's always going to be a problem with subjective evidence, that it could be a very good thing for someone to say, well, I'll take that as a starting point and try and find out for myself, if they're open to it. But for somebody who's not open to it, they can always explain that away.
I don't think he is open, although he declares quite frequently that if you bring me good evidence, I'll believe kind of thing. I don't really think he's thought through what the implications of that really are. Nor does he, to my mind anyway, take any account of what one might call cumulative evidence. I think a lot of things insignificant or unimportant in themselves can add up to a lot. And when I say a lot here, we're talking about millions. He somehow, in one of his books, I think maybe the one I showed you on the right, he does talk about modern neurological research and the implications that this might have for religion. His line there is, I think, as far as science goes, it's done all right. And therefore there's every reason to suppose that if we could go further, it would still do all right. So although he doesn't claim, for example, to have a scientific explanation of consciousness, and no one does, he somehow feels that it's there at the end of a road that science is already on. And that's a big thing to swallow. But he seems perfectly prepared to do it. Until you can demonstrate this won't work, he would say, this is the way I'm going. Don't bring all this extraneous spiritual stuff in. We don't need it. That's very much his line. Don't bring in anything that you don't need. I think he's very unsatisfying in consciousness, which I didn't talk about. That's another story.
Can I add just a point on that, David? I mean, in a sense, any human community engaged in any kind of activity, it's quite easy to deconstruct other people's belief systems, isn't it? I think this is where your point was also going. I mean, as an immunologist, I can imagine deconstructing the immunologist community. They all get together, they're all just a little community persuading each other about these immunological beliefs. You can do brain studies on their brains. You can see, brain imaging going on where they have these immunological beliefs and how very odd it is. So, one can take any kind of scientific or any community of any kind and do that deconstruction. But it all seems to me it probably neutralizes at the end. Doesn't get you very far, does it, David? I mean, at the end of the day, everyone has to justify their beliefs by certain appeals to rationalism or evidence, as you're suggesting. So the deconstruction route is a bit of a sterile route, isn't it?
I think so.
Please, we've got lots of hands. Well, come over here and then come up. Yes, please. Yes.
When you were talking about prophecy of what's going to happen, like the men landing on the moon, I recall a book called Gods of the North, and I think it was by Brian Branston or some such name, and I really must borrow the book again because I can remember one particular sentence in it that said, "These poets were in a fine frenzy and wrote far better than they could have known." And that, in a way, is where you're saying, where he's saying, that given the basis of what they actually knew, how on earth could they guess something that was far in advance of that? And I really must see if I can borrow the book again and read it more carefully. So that's one thing, and the other one is much quicker. I'm sure I remember things about monks doing an experiment with blessing some plants and cursing other plants, and the ones that they blessed came out better. But I suppose he would say that's not double-blind because they knew which plants they were looking after.
Hey, that's exactly what he would say.
Please, yes.
I'm a Christian, but earlier on in my life I was an atheist, and I read the God the Felt hypothesis and didn't find it very convincing at all. But actually, after your presentation, I have certain sympathy for something that Stenger said, which is this question of looking at prayer. So for those of us like myself who believe that God does answer prayer, and in cases where people are ill, it doesn't seem unreasonable for someone to say, I mean, I think it's very reasonable for me to say, imagine I prayed for my friend and they were healed, they seem to recover, to say this happened. It doesn't seem unreasonable for someone to say, let's have a methodological approach, which is the best we have, for getting out all of the sorts of effects where we sort of inadvertently cheat the results. So when someone does analyse prayer in this way and doesn't find that it works, we can say, well, you couldn't control God, so maybe he chose not to heal those people because the experiment was going on or whatever. But it seems a very defensive position for us to take. And it doesn't seem unfair for the skeptic to use this method to try and answer the question. I mean, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I pressed him on this question, this experimental evidence, and he says, well, all I'm doing is what a good scientist would do, and which really gets you nowhere. There is a canon of what is good science, and that's what I'm asking you to do, if you can't do that. I mean, on the general question you're raising, if you give me a particular example, I say that's anecdotal. If you give me 10 million examples, I stop to think. I think there is a difference between the cumulative effect of anecdotal evidence and the individual effect. And we typically don't believe the individual who says, God told me to do so and so, because if we did, we'd find he was telling to behave in a contradictory fashion, if for no other reason. But if a lot of people seem to have got the same message, that's a different thing altogether. I think there's really a corporate thing in belief. I think we do actually depend on other people as well as on ourselves, because a lot of our experience comes to us in that way. But that's a big story which I don't want to open up.
Okay, please. Yes.
Are you saying that the only evidence that Stenger is prepared to recognise is that which can be verified by an experiment? And if so, there's no history because the things that happen have only happened once, and you can't go back verify whether King Harold got an arrow in his eye at the Battle of Hastings or something like that. And you also don't recognise the value of any kind of natural science, which is simply an observation and an attempt to understand what is there. If you're saying that all that kind of knowledge, or if he's saying all that kind of knowledge, has to be completely discounted, is he putting himself into such a tiny corner that he can't actually look at the whole of the world, let alone look at the nature of Christian belief? So that's the first one that I'm asking. And then, if he is asking about Christian prayer, is he prepared to ask the question, if Christian prayer has at its heart the words, "Thy will be done," why do you look at it the wrong way round, rather than say, what has prayer done to that individual who, after a time of prayer, might have changed their life? And if that happens to people, could that prove that the prayer works? Because God has actually acted through the prayer on that person's life.
I don't think that would convince him. It might convince me. It might convince you. I think one has to use the word experiment in a fairly general term. I mean, there are laboratory experiments where you do things. The fulfillment of prophecy example is not quite. The experiment consists of observing the world and seeing whether something is there or not. You know, this thing is in Ezekiel, let us say. Has it actually happened? Has it said it? That's a straightforward test. And I think he's there using experiment in the sense of just observing whether something has happened or not. What I was going to do when I was preparing the original version of this seminar was to talk about social sciences, which I know more about than I know about physics, for example, or observational science, where you observe systems and try to set up models for what is going on, and try to get understanding of what's going on. I think that's offering a different kind of inference, but that led me so far astray. You would have been here till 3:30 or something. But I think that I don't want to sound carping, but I think his problem is that he's a physicist. And physicists get knowledge in particular ways, and dare I say it, everyone else's ways seem rather inferior. If only you could measure up to us, wouldn't it be wonderful? But the world isn't like that. A lot of scientific activity is like that. And he admits, actually, a lot of physics isn't like that. Because you don't often get critical experiments which say yes or no. It's all a bit messy, and people, do it, try it again, see if they can get the same result. It's not quite so right. That's how it actually goes. And I think he realizes that, and he says that. But I think there is a built-in inconsistency between his principles, which he enunciates very clearly, and I hope I haven't done him injustice, and the way the world actually is.
And can I just press you a little bit more on the first part of that question? I mean, isn't it the case that, as you were pointing out, the historians have their own way of justifying historical beliefs, and lawyers have their own way of justifying legal beliefs and so on, which are not science, they're not scientific beliefs, but they're evidence-based beliefs. I mean, how does he approach that? I mean, there are many different ways of justifying beliefs in different disciplines, aren't there? Every discipline has its own particular way of doing the job of justifying what it believes. So, did you get onto that in your discussion?
No.
Or? No. Okay. So,
and I think it would be foreign to his way of thinking. So I said he goes on these road tours where he's talking to one humanist group after another. There are very few examples in his itinerary that I could find, in fact I couldn't find any, where he'd actually spoken to people who would disagree with him. So I suspect that sort of question doesn't get raised. And if it were, he would say it's mischievous. I hope that's not being unfair to him. Please.
Can I just take up the point about subjective and objective? Because that seems to be the basis of most of his criticisms.
Yeah.
And yet if we look at science, we take physics. The actual beauty of that lies in its subjective bit. I mean, yesterday's quarks are tomorrow's strings. These are all, there isn't this diversion, this divarication between objective and subjective. It doesn't exist. And once you accept that, to a large extent, his basis is undermined.
That's an interesting remark, because in that book Quantum Gods, which I showed, he has a lot which is science actually, and he's really gunning for ESP rather than Christian belief. And a lot of it is basic elementary mechanics about inertia and momentum and all that sort of thing. And the rest, there's another big chunk on particle physics. And the contrast between the two which you're making is very obvious. You know, we can all push things and feel impacts and so on, but we have second-hand observations on the whole for observing what goes on at the micro level. I mean, I'm sure what he would say is there are observable phenomena like sparks and all that kind of thing, but I don't think he's thought through that deeply enough. That's the problem.
Okay, I think let's have time for one more question, I think. Does anyone else want to have a point? Yes, you want to come back
I
and
was just going
say
to point out he seems entirely unaware of the whole genre of the sociology of scientific knowledge, which makes all of these points that if you actually ask what do scientists do when they make their assertions to knowledge, they don't actually follow their own scientific method. And this is a huge
Well,
jump.
on the morning that I met him, they did two things on the same morning. I was after coffee, and Steve Fuller, Warwick, was there before. And he had a rough time with Steve Fuller. He really couldn't make anything of him. He said to me over coffee, well, at least we ought to be able to get on together. And I think that was because, you know, Steve Fuller was talking a language which he didn't understand. I don't know whether I understand it, mind you, but I mention that as an example, something that was totally opposed to the kind of thing that he's used to talking about. And I did feel I could talk to him on his terms, because I understood what he was saying. I don't think he understands very much outside that.
I believe, just an extra, but wasn't Thomas S. Kuhn the person who coined the paradigm? A physicist, wasn't he a physicist?
And I think this is all an illustration of the fact we need a lot more teaching of philosophy of science way back at school, actually, and the huge lack of teaching of philosophy of science amongst scientists. And I think we could all benefit from that, actually, and gradually it seems to be coming more into the educational system, but very, very slowly. So I think that would help us all of us who are in the scientific community especially, and no doubt many outside. So let's thank David very much indeed for an interesting talk.